Gentleness was never necessary for Sebastian Bach. With a long, high, and unrepentant cry, he entered the world. Tens of thousands of fans were shouting along to the rebellious anthems of 18 in life, and by the time he was 21, his voice was resonating through stadiums. And young people gone crazy. Bach swiftly established himself as a representation of the glam metal movement at the close of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s with his flowing hair, defiant gaze, and fast-paced performances. However, it was that very ego and wildness that got him into unavoidable problems. He was sued for hurling a bottle into the audience, was expelled from the band over the phone, and eventually saw a whole genre that he had previously helped to dominate slip into obscurity. Sebastian, however, never vanished. He didn't die young like a lot of other rock stars, he didn't go totally crazy with drugs, and he didn't plead for a chance to be famous again. Despite occasionally losing his voice, losing his house, and frequently losing friends, he continued to sing. He performed in musicals, went on solo tours, paid the price, and got back up on his own 2 feet. Just his voice and an unshakable spirit, with no record label tugging strings or a large band behind him. This article will walk you through Sebastian Bach's turbulent journey from a disobedient teenager in Ontario to one of the most iconic voices of the 1990s. It tells the tale of his rise to fame, defiance, loss, and why, despite everything, he continues to be one of the most honest screams in rock history. Early years. Sebastian Bach did not grow up in a rock and roll family. In Freeport, Bahamas, on April 3, 1968, he was born, a long way from the stage lights and even further away from the yelling guitars that would come to characterize his life. Born Sebastian Philip Bierk, he was the son of schoolteacher Joan Bierk and famous painter David Bierk. Sebastian's youth, which was characterized by both artistic inspiration and inevitable undercurrents of strife, began when this Canadian family relocated from the Bahamas to California and then settled in the sleepy hamlet of Peterborough, Ontario. When he was still a child, his parents were divorced. Although Sebastian spent the majority of his time with his mother, he was often reminded of his father. A gifted, rigorous artist with high standards. David wished for his kid to pursue a legitimate artistic career, receive an education, enroll in Juilliard, and lead a disciplined life. Sebastian, however, was never the submissive youngster who sat silently behind a canvas. He was impetuous, rebellious, and never concealed the raging artist's ego within him. Sebastian was characterized as a bully in school despite receiving an A grade. He was a student at Lakefield College. Prince Andrew once attended this esteemed boarding school. Sebastian didn't think twice about calling the prince a complete jerk in an interview with Rolling Stone. It was more than a joke. It was a mindset, a blatant early act of defiance against formality and authority in all its forms. For Sebastian, music was a form of natural resistance. He had committed all of Kiss, Judas Priest's, and Rush's catalogs to memory by the age of 13. He left home at the age of 15, quit school, and relocated to Toronto to play in local rock bands at venues where the majority of the other musicians were decades his senior. As a teenager, he was already more than 6 feet tall, so he could easily pass for an adult and act at places that didn't allow children. Sebastian first experienced the stage, inebriated crowds, and the rough-and-tumble life of touring musicians with his first band, Kid Wicked. In Sebastian's world at the time, there were no large stages, theatrical lighting, or professional studios, just a naive hope that he would become well-known and an untrained voice that could break boundaries in a small space. That youngster was completely aware that he didn't fit the model his father had in mind for him, even if he had no knowledge of money, fame, or copyright rules. And a rocker was created in that tumultuous void between unfulfilled expectations and vague freedom. Sebastian Bach's own way, without warning, without submission, and without expressing regret to anybody, rather than the way most are fashioned. Early career. Sebastian Bach's ambition of becoming a rock star had come true by the time he was 18. It was now considered a way of life. Possessing a distinctive appearance, long hair, tall stature, and stage warrior attitude, as well as a soaring, steel-edged voice, Bach started to gain popularity in the local music scene of Toronto. He performed with groups like Modamax and Kid Wicked during those formative years, wandering around small bars where the flickering lights were unable to conceal his weariness or put out the fire that was burning within of him. Then the chance presented itself. From the most surprising source, a wedding. Bach received an invitation to play at the 1987 wedding of renowned rock photographer Mark Weiss, who had taken pictures of numerous well-known bands. Sebastian performed at that celebration with such legendary artists as Twisted Sister, Quiet Riot's Kevin Dubrow, and even Zakk Wylde, Ozzy Osbourne's newest guitarist at the moment. Sebastian was unaware that a man named David Feld, a close friend of the band Skid Row, who were looking for a singer, was one of the wedding attendees. A cassette tape showed up at Sebastian's house a few weeks later. 4 unfinished demo recordings from the oddly named band Skid Row were included. The tracks that stood out were Youth Gone Wild, Life, and 18. Before making a choice, Sebastian repeatedly played them until he learned every note by heart. In reference to Rob Halford's trademark high-pitched screams, I'm going to rework the melody, add a little Halford flair, and personalize them. The zeal of youth wasn't the only thing. It was Destiny's first flash. It was neither a formal audition room or a chilly studio when he got to New Jersey for the audition. At a rundown club called Mingles, he met Rob Refusal, Scotty Hill, Rachel Bolan, Snake Sabo, and members of Skid Row. There were no contracts that evening. After someone made fun of Bach, they went on stage, performed, and then got into a brawl with the audience. They clashed in perfect timing like shattered pieces that somehow fit together perfectly on the first night they met. We were already engaged in combat together, Snake Sabo subsequently recounted. I've never had a more peculiar connection with somebody. He was the missing component, and I knew it. Sebastian Bach thus took over as Skid Row's lead vocalist. No written plot, no strict management contract, no conventional casting, just a voice, an impromptu jam session, and an instinct that was so instinctive that there was no turning back. It marked the start of a phenomenon rather than merely a band. Sebastian Bach, to be exact. Professional achievement. Sebastian Bach did not pursue a career in music. He barged in. Skid Row was no longer an obscure New Jersey band the instant his scream ripped through untamed youth. They evolved into a musical statement that included hard rock, punk attitude, growling metal, and unrepentant rebellion. And the band's sharpest edge was Bach, whose voice cut through the air like a sword. With 3 consecutive attacks, their 1989 first album, Skid Row, which was produced by Michael Wagoner, stormed into the scene. 18 in Life, Youth Gone Wild, and I Remember You. Each of the 3 reflected a distinct shade of Bach's identity, although they all appeared on the Billboard Hot 100. One was dark, one was heartbreakingly tender, and one was wild. One thing was made plain by all of them. This man was more than simply a screamer. This musician has the ability to captivate audiences. Soon after, Skid Row received invitations to open for well-known performers like Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, and eventually Guns N' Roses. But, driven by Bach's frenzied energy and unadulterated charm, Skid Row began transforming support slots into their own stages, in contrast to many bands of the time who were overshadowed by their headliners. Bach did more than just sing while on tour, he also ran, jumped, screamed, cursed, threw bottles, and took the consequences. When their second album, Slave to the Grind, was released in 1991, they reached their real zenith. This Skid Row was no longer radio-friendly. The record was more introspective, darker, heavier, and brutally honest. The band's willingness to delve deeply into topics of addiction, deceit, and the breakdown of faith was demonstrated with songs like Monkey Business, Quicksand Jesus, and Wasted Time. Slave to the Grind became the first hard rock album in history to debut at number 1 thanks to its heavy content. The NWA, Nirvana, and all other competitors at the time were surpassed by one on the Billboard 200. Sebastian Bach was astounded, too. However, behind the scenes, fissures were starting to appear while commercial success screamed from the front of the stage. Sebastian had grown so much that the media began to link Skid Row more with him than the band. The public remembered Bach more for his impetuous interviews, outlandish claims, and inflammatory banners waved on stage than for his musical compositions. People would ask me what a song meant, and Sebastian would go on stage and say something that made no sense at all, as bassist and co-founder Rachel Bolan once adamantly acknowledged. I eventually had the impression that my voice was being taken away. Sebastian Bach's voice, face, and energy were all the things Skid Row needed to blow up. However, that same power increased the brightness, speed, and danger of the fire. They had evolved beyond a band seeking not. They turned into a living, breathing example of defiance, complete with blood, tears, and consequences. It was the beginning of an inevitable collapse and the kind of pinnacle that every band aspires to. However, none of them stopped to think about the end at that moment. They continued to sing, to burn, to live as if the future would never come. Sebastian Bach continued to scream louder and soar higher like a firework. And setting fire to every obstacle in his way. Sebastian Bach once remarked, "I don't need to do anything to stand out. Collapse and breakup. I simply sing, and the rest falls into place." However, it's not always easy to pay the price of being seen. Internal fissures widened after Skid Row's success with Slave to the Grind peaked, brewing beneath the stage like smoke until everything blew one day. A series of unfortunate events began with an unexpected accident in December 1989. Bach was hit in the head by a bottle thrown by a fan while he was opening for Aerosmith. He hurled it back mindlessly, hitting an innocent concert goer with the glass as it flew into the crowd. Bach was given a 3-year probationary term after the small child was hurt and her family filed a lawsuit. However, he was the most knowledgeable. I gave them all that I had ever deserved. For the first time, his fame came with a sentence and a judgment rather than cheers. And for the first time, the repercussions of real life were visible despite the limelight. However, the storm didn't end there. Something inside Skid Row started to freeze as the band went on tour. The group's lead songwriter, Rachel Bolan, believed that Bach's public image was taking precedence over the music. Bach wanted to write more in response. Make the band more aggressive, heavier, and desirous of things that didn't suit the classic Skid Row formula. Previously the cornerstones of the band, the two now viewed one another as disparate universes. Bolan acknowledged that he would have left the stage long ago if he hadn't faked a smile, referring to the instances in which Bach made offensive jokes or made up song backstories that he wasn't involved in crafting. The music industry was changing at the same time. When Nirvana released Nevermind in 1991, all of the gaudy metal bands were pushed to the sidelines by the grunge movement. Once a glam metal legend, Skid Row abruptly lost their relevance. MTV turned away. They were no longer covered by magazines. Subhuman Race, their 1995 album, was more contemplative, darker, and heavier, but it didn't help them. Only at number 1 did it reach its peak. Billboard featuring Kurt Besch. The number of tours decreased. There were only 7 members of the team, and they were all sleeping aboard an old tour bus. 3 limos were once ours. One participant told Spin magazine, "Now we wait for a hotel shuttle." Then, like so many rock tragedies, it ended with a small, devastating blow rather than a big event. Sebastian Bach proposed that they go on tour with Kiss in late 1996. The others declined. According to them, Skid Row should no longer serve as an opening act. A voicemail Bach placed on Snake Sabo's answering machine on Thanksgiving Day, full of abrasive, inexcusable language, was the last straw as tensions increased and egos battled. Snake only uttered one thing after hearing it. "That man is no longer someone I want to play with in a band." Bach was let go from Skid Row 2 days prior to Christmas that year. No goodbyes, no press releases, no nice words. Suddenly, it ended with a phone call. Sebastian didn't yet realize that the large stages wouldn't welcome him back the way they had when he left the band he had guided to the top. Alternative rock was now broadcast on MTV. Kurt Cobain was the only topic covered by magazines. Those who formerly referred to him as a phenomenon now shunned him like a relic from the past that should be forgotten. Bach once remarked, "I thought a band couldn't break up just because of a few egos. But that's exactly what I went through." The sound of a bygone past reverberated behind him. A world that no longer welcomed him was ahead. And Sebastian Bach didn't scream for the first time in his life. He simply left in silence. By itself. Private life. Few people would guess that Sebastian Bach is a man who genuinely values family despite the heartbreaking screams and the turbulent existence on stage. Beneath the long hair and leather jackets lies a man who has always struggled to protect what was private, even if he hasn't always prevailed. Bach married Maria Aquinoff in 1992, when he was at the height of his fame. His girlfriend back when no one knew who he was. They have 3 kids together and were together for almost 20 years. It appeared to the general public to be a stable marriage, which is uncommon in a world full of drunks, groupies, and restless nights. In actuality, however, their lives were overburdened by constant touring, financial strain following Skid Row, and Bach's instability, a man who could lose his cool over trivial matters. Then stop talking for weeks. Maria and Sebastian secretly got divorced in 2010. He merely mentioned that it was a chapter that was kindly ended, without going into more detail. However, his close friends claim that it was a period of silent crisis for him, as he lost his family, stopped performing on huge stages, and faced middle age alone in a generation that the world had moved on from. He was attempting to start over in 2011 when he was struck by another blow. Hurricane Irene wrecked everything in his New Jersey home. It was more than a house. It was a storehouse of memories, old photos, original Skid Row cassette recordings, and his massive Kiss memorabilia collection, which he had treasured since he was a teenager. "I lost everything, music, memories, pieces of myself from the past," he posted on Facebook. "I must learn how to begin over." Sebastian Bach started dating Vietnamese-American model Suzanne Liu in public a year later, in 2012. They married discreetly, without fanfare, and without making headlines in 2015. Since then, he frequently describes her as the piece I needed most after a lifetime of shouting. In the few interviews he does discuss his personal life. No more ludicrous remarks, no more boisterous altercations in public, just a 50-year-old guy who continues to sing, tour, and return home to a waiting audience. Sebastian keeps a perfect distance from his kids, never being intrusive but always being there. Bach once remarked, "I don't push him to be famous because I don't want him to pay the price I did." His oldest son likewise followed music. When the stage lights go out, not all rock stars know how to live. Sebastian Bach discovered, however, that the guy who once sung for a generation of rebels is now living more slowly, not to become silent, but to ensure that his voice doesn't get lost in the cacophony of a too loud life, not by settling, but by accepting. Legacy and influence for fans, from the late 1980s MTV generation to today's devoted rockers, Sebastian Bach is still the band's indispensable soul from its heyday, even though Skid Row may have carried on with a changing lineup of vocalists following Bach's departure. A live example of controlled mayhem, he was more than simply a voice. Few have been able to match his explosive stage presence since. Bach's singing did not follow the route of mechanical, icy accuracy. He screamed deeply and with real, powerful emotion in his singing. Soft enough to sing "I Remember You" and silence a whole room, yet able to swoop like Halford when called upon. Numerous metal and hard rock singers of succeeding generations, from underground bands to those that came up in the post-MTV era, were affected by his distinctive high notes and his almost fractured phrasing style. However, Bach left behind more than just music. With his main roles in Jesus Christ Superstar Jekyll and Hyde, he left the rock stage and made his Broadway debut. His performing style was captivating and vibrant, never ostentatious yet hard to miss. It was an artist's inclination to leave his comfort zone, it had nothing to do with demonstrating anything. Additionally, he appeared on television, playing noteworthy supporting parts in Trailer Park Boys, Californication, and Gilmore Girls. Even though he was never a movie star, he was always authentically himself, unforced and uninhibited. Even when glam music dwindled into the past, his honesty enabled him maintain a devoted following for more than 30 years. Sebastian Bach is one of the few rock musicians who survived that tumultuous time period and who has maintained the majority of his vocal range into his 50s. The fire in those high notes, the kind that makes people stand up, cheer, and never forget, still burns even though it has become a little deeper and raspier. Instead of becoming a relic of nostalgia, he became a live example of the idea that rock will always be around as long as there are genuine voices to express its anguish and anger. And the reason Sebastian Bach is still mentioned isn't only because he was well known, it's also because he never abandoned the music that kept him alive. Because he maintained the integrity, steadfastness, and uncompromising truth of his artist. Present life. While many of his contemporaries have faded from the spotlight or withdrawn behind the scenes, Sebastian Bach is still touring and performing in his 50s, not to prove anything, but just because he can't stop singing. Bach continued to perform regularly throughout the 2010s, particularly at rock festivals, clubs, and nostalgia-driven venues across North America and Europe, despite not being on the charts or in the media's constant rotation. He is not afraid of the past. Instead, he embraces it as a part of who he is, performing Skid Row hits like 18 in Life, I Remember You, and Slave to the Grind on a daily basis. These are the same songs that brought him to the top and now keep him connected to a devoted fan base. It hasn't been simple to continue this trip, though. Sebastian has fought vocal cord problems for years, had multiple vocal therapy sessions, and had surgery. Instead of reaching the same lofty heights, the voice that was once praised as young Rob Halford now carries a depth and emotional weight that youth was unable to provide. I can't scream like I did in 1989, he claimed in one interview. I know how to make people feel more now. He's also returned to new music, slowly but never stopping. In 2014, he released the album Give Him Hell, which received positive feedback from critics and the traditional metal community. While it wasn't a commercial explosion, it made clear that he doesn't live in the past. He still writes, still challenges himself, still moves forward, even if the storm has quieted. Beyond music, Bach remains creatively active, starring in Broadway productions, Jekyll and Hyde, Jesus Christ Superstar, appearing in TV series, Gilmore Girls, Trailer Park Boys, and guesting on reality shows and late-night talk shows. Though he occasionally retains that wild streak in his public persona, it's clear today's Sebastian Bach is more grounded, more in control, a rocker who once burned bright and now burns steadily. In 2024, Bach announced he was recording a new album, marking over 35 years since audiences first heard his voice echo through massive crowds. He's appeared at nostalgic events like Monsters of Rock Cruise, M3 Rock Festival, and still receives thunderous love from the generation that grew up with him. But perhaps the most touching part is how he neither denies his past nor lives stuck in it. When asked if he'd ever reunite with Skid Row, Bach responded candidly, that door was never locked. But if I had to choose between reuniting and being myself, I'd still choose this voice, even if it's a little raspy, it's mine. Sebastian Bach's life today isn't loud, scandalous, or stadium-sized anymore, but it holds peace, freedom, and above all, a man still standing tall with the very voice that once lifted him, once broke him, and ultimately kept him in this world. Sebastian Bach is no longer the lanky kid belting out youth gone wild with flowing hair and defiant eyes. But his soul, that wild, fiery, unrelenting spirit, remains fully intact after more than 3 decades, now shaped by scars, by time, and by the kind of falls only those who've lived it can truly understand. He once had it all. Fame, fortune, worship, and then lost it all. Bandmates, a home, a voice nearly beyond repair. But at every crossroads, instead of begging to return to the spotlight, Sebastian chose the harder path, to keep living as a real person, unpolished, unfiltered, uninterested in chasing trends. He didn't become the symbol of a dead genre. He became the survivor of an entire era. Not by hiding from it, but by never abandoning what he believed in. In a musical world that grows slicker, more digital, and more disposable by the day, Sebastian Bach is a raw, honest heartbeat. He doesn't scream for attention anymore. He sings to remind us that rock, if it's not real, is nothing at all. He is proof of a career that wasn't perfect or clean, but fierce, meaningful, and worthy of being remembered with nothing less than respect. And whether or not Skid Row ever reunites, whether or not radio stations still spin those 90s anthems, one thing's for certain. Every time a guitar kicks off 18 in life, people will remember him. The man who lived, burned bright, and never apologized for being exactly who he was. What do you think about Sebastian Bach's stormy yet proud journey? Which of his songs defined your youth? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the living legends of rock with us. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.